Hi, I'm Gordon from Camera Labs, and this is a review of the Fujifilm GFX100RF in beautiful Iceland. In the famous words of Jordan Drake, "Film on location, you coward." So inspired by that quote, I've decided to do just that. This is a family holiday, which I've paid for, but I thought because the landscapes are so beautiful, why not use it as an opportunity to test a camera that is surely aimed at this kind of landscape photography. So let's see what it'll do. Future Gordon here with a quick bit of housekeeping. If you are interested in finding out about the controls, the design, and how the GFX100RF works, check out my first looks review of it. And I also have a second video which takes a really in-depth look at the image quality. This video that you're watching right now, though, is more about my experiences of using the camera on a week-long trip around Iceland. So let's go. Okay, so the first thing I wanted to talk about was the overall handling, the design, the controls of the GFX100RF. And for someone like me, who normally shoots with an X100V, not a 6, a 5, this is a very, very familiar experience. Please forgive the geothermal activity around us. It's a kind of bigger, chunkier version of an X100, and to me that makes it very easy to get to grips with. We've got very, very similar controls. Got an aperture ring around the lens and a control ring, which, like my X100, I've got assigned to adjusting the film simulation, so it's really nice to just switch between them using that. Shutter speed dial on the top, exposure compensation, this power switch with the shutter release inside. But I feel the GFX100RF also inherits some of the control issues that I've at least personally had with the X100 series. Namely, whenever I pull it out of my bag, I really have to watch the exposure compensation dial, because frequently it is turned and your pictures are going to be too bright or too dark, so you've got to keep your eye on that. I wish it was lockable. Secondly, whenever I take it out of my bag, it's always switched on. I switch it off when I put it in my bag, but when I bring it out, it's switched on. So something's going on there. I also find that the way I hold the camera, or at least pick it up, I'm accidentally flicking this switch on the front, which by default changes the crop. So I suddenly find the view is more cropped in than I naturally assume it would be, and I have to again look at the settings on the screen and remind myself that I need to zoom out if I want to capture the full 28mm and 102 megapixels. And finally, a note on the joystick at the back, which to me sometimes works and sometimes doesn't. There'll be times that I'm pushing it and it's very responsive and it goes exactly where I want it, but there's other times that I'm pushing it and it doesn't seem to respond at all. I don't know if that is because this is an early production sample or that's how it's going to be, but I feel that sometimes I'm really working against that joystick, and that does frustrate me a little bit. If the weather's likely to change, it's nice to know that you can make the GFX100RF weatherproofed. It works in the same way as the X100 series, so you have to unscrew a little ring on the end of the lens barrel, screw on the filter mount, and that then lets you put on 49mm filters. I've got a clear one mounted on here, and then this additional rather groovy looking lens hood. Now, these were all optional accessories on the X100, but Fujifilm now includes them on the GFX100F, so hopefully I should be good to go. One of the features that I was a little bit skeptical about at first, but I've actually come to really appreciate, is the aspect ratio switch on this camera. Now, all it is doing is cropping the image, but you have such a high resolution image to start with, you've got plenty of pixels even afterwards, especially if you just go for like a horizontal panoramic crop. And that's what I've done for this view here. Is absolutely gorgeous, but there isn't a great deal at the top and the bottom. So I've really been adopting the 17:6 aspect ratio for that really wide panoramic view. Looks really nice. So I've been trying my hand at some long exposures of the various waterfalls and streams around Iceland. And one of the nice features on the GFX100RF, like the X100 series, is its built-in neutral density filter. It's only 3 stops, but it does give you the handy ability to use slightly longer shutter speeds to blur motion. But I do also have the weather sealing kit fitted to the camera, which also equips it with a 49mm filter thread, so you could of course also fit other neutral density filters. And in case you were wondering, I've got the camera on a Fujifilm TT224 mini tripod. I've got a separate review of that on my channel. One of the real benefits of the GFX100RF that you don't often see mentioned in all reviews is the battery life. Fujifilm, because of the size of the sensor and the size of the body to accommodate it, have been able to put in a really decent sized battery inside this camera. And I've really noticed it when I'm in pretty cold surroundings like I'm in right now. Normally I'd expect a battery in a fixed lens compact to last me a day if I'm lucky, and I'd have to be really conscious about topping it up, say in a car. But I've managed to get about 2.5 days worth of pretty heavy photography out of each charge on this battery. So I'm pretty pleased with the battery life on this camera. One of the more unique features of the GFX100RF is in fact nothing to do with the sensor, other than the fact that the sensor's height has meant that Fujifilm has had to build a taller body, and that in turn has allowed them to accommodate not one, but 2 SD memory card slots, which is pretty unique for a fixed lens compact camera. And what that means, as with other cameras with twin slots, is that you can set this camera up for redundancy. 2 cards recording the same file, so if one of them becomes corrupt, the other one should still have your data. And that's really important if you're on a once-in-a-lifetime holiday, or you're photographing a really important event like a wedding or something along those lines. It really gives you the extra security that is lacking on a lot of fixed lens compacts. One of the things I like about the GFX100RF coming from an X100 is that it fits in the same bag that I use to carry it around. So it means that when I see something I want to take a picture of, I can pull it out, take the shot, and pop it right back in again. And that's even with the weather sealing lens hood attached. If I take that off, I can actually get my glasses and a small water bottle in there, or the pocket 3. Alright, and now I want to talk about the viewfinder, because this is called the GFX100RF, and that RF stands for rangefinder, but it's actually rangefinder style. There is no rangefinder viewfinder in this camera. And in fact, one of the first things that I wanted to mention is that it's missing a rectangle on the front here. If this were an X100 series, you'd have the optical portion of the viewfinder here, but this is only an electronic viewfinder, and I do actually think it lacks that square, that rectangular window there really gave the X100 a nice style. This is less classy, I feel, as a result, but I never ever used that optical portion of the viewfinder on the X100 series. I'm sorry to say it, it's very, very clever, but I never used it. I only used the electronic portion. So I'm pleased to report that the electronic viewfinder in this camera is really, really good. It's high resolution, it's large, it's bright, and because most viewfinder panels are 4x3 shaped, it matches the native shape of the sensor. So you get a really big image through the viewfinder when you compose. So I'm perfectly happy, although maybe they'd want to just draw a rectangle on the front to give it that X100 style. Right, now I wanted to talk about the 2 most contentious aspects of the GFX100RF, and they are, of course, the lens with an f4 aperture and the lack of any kind of stabilization, at least for photos. Did I enjoy my trip? I'll see you next fall. Now, I'm going to cover them both together because they do actually impact each other, but I'm going to talk more in this video about the impact they actually had on my day-to-day photography, rather than just saying what it actually means specs wise, because for me sometimes it was no issue at all, and at other times it was a big issue. So let's start off with the f4 aperture and talk about depth of field. For my own photography, if I'm photographing a distant landscape, it doesn't matter. If I'm doing a portrait shot, I would have liked a little bit more blurring in the background. That's something that I did get with, say, the Leica Q343, or even the original Q3, because that's got quite a bright aperture. However, if you do get quite close to your subject and you exploit that minimum focusing distance, then you can achieve some slightly blurry effects. You can see in these pictures here that I have managed to throw the background out of focus at least a little bit and allow you to concentrate on the focused areas. But this is no bokeh monster. You're not going to get substantially blurred backgrounds with this lens. However, for me, practically speaking, the bigger issue was in terms of exposure, especially when you combine that f4 aperture with no stabilization. Now, your mileage will of course vary, but I found that I actually need a shutter speed of at least 125th of a second to reliably handhold perfectly sharp images with the GFX100RF. Now I've heard some people say, oh, I was able to handhold 60th, 30th, 15th if I was leaning against a wall. Well, I've also managed to do that, but not consistently, and that is the important factor. I don't think there's any point in having that big high resolution sensor if you're not actually going to be able to exploit that resolution, enjoy that resolution on every frame. So the problem then becomes, what kind of sensitivity are you going to need to be shooting at 125th of a second at f4 when it starts getting dim? And as soon as you hit blue hour, like this scene in Reykjavik, where I wasn't that happy with the audio, so I'll just show you what it looks like. I was getting very frustrated when I was trying to photograph those colourful buildings because my ISO suddenly jumped to 1600 or 3200 ISO in order to maintain that 125th of a second shutter speed with the f4 aperture. The same situation I experienced in Prague at night. All of my pictures were at 3200. Now luckily 3200 ISO on this sensor still looks pretty good, and I've got a separate video which details the quality in depth if you want to compare that against the lower sensitivities, but of course it's not going to look as good as it does at 80 or 100 ISO. And revealingly, when I was testing the X100VI around Japan under similar conditions, blue hour and night time, I found that the brighter f2 aperture coupled with IBIS was allowing me to shoot at sufficiently slow shutter speeds to actually always be shooting at the lowest base sensitivity, I think 125 or 160 ISO, and all my pictures were looking absolutely crisp. Oh, and in case you're still thinking 125th of a second is way too high, revealingly, if you look at Fujifilm's own auto ISO settings and look at the shutter speed that it uses as the default minimum before it starts boosting the ISO, is it a 60th? Is it a 30th? No, it's 125th by default, which to me implies that, well, they kind of think you need that as well, at least for consistency. So the question, as always, becomes, what kind of pictures are you taking under what kind of situations, and what are your expectations for them? If you're taking photos under bright daylight conditions, the GFX100RF will absolutely knock you out with its image quality, hugely detailed files, incredibly clean. But if you're shooting at night, handheld, you are going to be suffering from higher sensitivities than you may want to be using. Of course, if you can put the camera on a tripod or even balance it on a wall, you can use those lower ISOs and slower shutter speeds in order to get a nice clean image. But if you're hand holding under dimmer conditions, be warned. Well, I'm back at the seaside in sunny Brighton. I had a wonderful week in Iceland, and I've also had a few days to think about how the GFX100RF performed on that trip. So the first thing I wanted to mention is the experience compared to shooting with an X100V, which is what I'd normally be taking away with me. Now, obviously the GFX100RF is a bigger, chunkier, heavier camera all round, but not substantially so. It is in a similar ballpark to the X100 series. It fits in the same type of bag or pocket. And in terms of handling and controls, it feels very, very familiar. If you're used to using an X100, you're going to get to grips with it straight away. And it will deliver that big boost in resolution under the right conditions, which I think is what some people are looking for from this camera. And it's also important to note that while the camera is taller to accommodate the bigger sensor, it has allowed Fujifilm to incorporate those twin memory card slots and the decent sized battery, both of which are in some contrast to normal fixed lens compacts. I mean, certainly with the X100V, I generally have to recharge that battery most evenings, whereas with the GFX100RF, I actually only needed to charge it once midway through that trip in Iceland, and believe me, it was very cold and very windy. Okay, so how about image quality? Well, it won't surprise you to learn that it is very, very good. You're getting that extremely high resolution sensor and a very, very sharp lens in front of it that performs absolutely fine across the frame, even wide open at f4. So under decent lighting conditions, or if you can use the lower ISO settings, you're going to get a big upgrade in image quality over an X100. And in fact, under those conditions, probably the best image quality you're going to get from any fixed lens compact right now. But you have to make sure that the 28mm equivalent coverage is going to work for you, because as soon as you start cropping that image to zoom in a little bit digitally, you lose resolution fast. For example, the first notch on the digital teleconverter, which takes you to around 35mm equivalent, will reduce that resolution from around 100 to around 60 megapixels. At the next notch, you're down to around 30 megapixels, and the next notch still, which is around 63mm equivalent, will be down to 20 megapixels. So I would say you're only really going to get the best from this camera if you're shooting it at the 28mm full coverage or at a push around 35mm. And I should note that when you do crop into that 35mm equivalent focal length, the camera can use the spare pixels around the side to give a kind of rangefindery style view in the viewfinder or on the screen, where you effectively see what's around the edges of the frame before it actually enters the capture area. And that's really nice for anyone who misses the optical viewfinder of an X100 series. But while I personally avoid cropping too much for the best quality from the camera, there was one type of crop that I fully approve of, and that is the wider aspect ratios that you can access from that new dedicated dial. In particular, the 17:6 panoramic aspect ratio, which I used a lot in Iceland for those huge epic landscape views. And in fact, I believe this is the GFX100RF's secret weapon, because rather than thinking of a medium format sensor that's been cropped vertically, how about thinking of it as having two APS-C sensors that you've sandwiched together to capture a really wide field of view? And that is actually effectively what you're getting. I did the maths already for you, and if you were to take two APS-C sensors and stick them together, you would end up with pretty much the same active area as a GFX sensor that's been cropped vertically into that shape. And wrapping up, even though I've already talked about it in this video, the two controversies of an f4 lens and lack of image stabilization didn't affect me during the daytime for those big landscape views. It only became an issue at night when I was shooting handheld and I was having to use high ISOs in order to achieve a fast enough shutter speed for a nice sharp image. Again, if you're shooting on a tripod at night, no problem at all, you're going to get some great looking pictures. But if you want really clean images at night, handheld, you're going to be better off using a camera that has some kind of image stabilization, for example the X100RF. And in terms of potential for blurring in the background, at f4 you're not going to get a huge amount unless you're very, very close to the subject, and even then it's not substantial. So if you are a bokeh monster and you're after a much blurrier background, then you're also going to be better served by a camera with a brighter aperture lens and a longer focal length to start with, something maybe like a Leica Q3-43. And that marks the end of this review. I hope you enjoyed my entirely on-location presentation. Do let me know in the comments if you'd like to see more filmed in this style. I certainly enjoyed doing it, and it was nice to give you more of a personal approach to what I thought worked and what didn't work for me, as opposed to just doing a more general technical review. But I still have that style of video about the GFX100RF if you're interested, so do check that out. Right, that's it for now. I think I'm going to enjoy a nice little stroll by the beach. I'll see you next time. Thanks for watching. Bye-bye.